Bonjour à tous. Good afternoon, everyone. We are going to start this press conference, which will focus on the poorest countries in the world. There are 46, and they are the subject of the least developed countries report UNCTAD is producing every year. We are under embargo until 4 p.m. this afternoon, Geneva time. And without any further ado, I'm going to give the floor to Rebeca Grynspan, UNCTAD Secretary General, and Junior Davis will supplement her presentation. He is the head of the Analysis and Politics branch, and then we'll open the floor for questions. Thank you very much for joining us, and SG, you have the floor.
Thank you. Thank you very much, dear members of the press, dear friends, dear colleagues. Well, today we present to you UNCTAD's 2023 Least Developed Countries Report. The report is entitled Crisis Resilient Development Finance. Crisis Resilient Development Finance, which is an extremely urgent matter. Our report makes it very clear least developed countries are in a desperate situation, marked by the COVID pandemic, from which they have not yet recovered, a cost of living crisis, which is hitting them disproportionately, a climate crisis towards which they are completely exposed, and a debt burden that rising interest rates are making totally unbearable. So, without exaggeration, least developed countries, those at the very front line of sustainable development, stand on the precipice of a fiscal abyss. The number speaks volumes, and they speak with urgency. So, import costs for basic food surged by 63% over the last 3 years, mounting a bill of $35 billion in 2022. 63% surge. Debt service in LDCs soared to $27 billion in 2021, a staggering 37% increase from $20 billion in the previous year. Today, LDCs are not only spending more on debt service than on either health or education, on average, obviously, but they are spending almost twice as much on debt than on health. As we reported last year, LDCs face both the highest burden in per capita terms to meet their energy transition needs, as well as the highest disaster costs if they don't transition in time. So they are between a rock and a hard place. Out of the 20 countries most vulnerable to climate change, 17 are LDCs. At the same time, installed capacity in renewable energy needs to increase by a factor of, and see this comparison. In most advanced economies, the factor is 2.5 times what we need to see in the renewable energy sector. What is the factor in least developed countries? 25. 2.5 times in developed countries. 25 times increase in least developed countries. Indeed, a recent UNCTAD Sustainable Development Goal transitions costing exercise shows that LDCs face the highest per capita cost to meet their sustainable development goals relative to the base of their economies. just reaching the goals for social protection and decent jobs would cost an average of 45% of GDP in LDCs. So the question is, where will the money come from? Our report is devoted to answering that question. But the premise for any real answer to it is this. LDCs are in a debt trap, and only more debt will not get them out of it. If we don't understand that, we won't be able to find the solutions. They will need grants, concessional loans, and debt relief, the three of them. LDCs need an important amount of resources from overseas, because the resources cannot come only from the mobilization of domestic resources. Obviously, there has to be a mobilization and an effort in mobilizing domestic resources. But we know that whatever they do, it won't be enough. Many of the resources will have to come from outside. So these resources need to be long-run, low-cost, and accessible, and of sufficient scale. According to a novel UNCTAD SDG costing methodology, LDCs face an over $100 billion annual funding gap to meet their SDG transition needs. And this is a number that is the first time that we put forward. The biggest gap, very interesting, is in education, which amounts to $57 billion. For the energy transition, LDCs face an annual funding gap of $13 billion. So this immediately points to the very architecture of the international financial system. The scale of the issue is so large for these countries that only a multilateral solution will do. However, the system we have is either too small or not adapted to deliver. Why I say too small? Well, you know that we have been given this number that the World Bank today is one-fifth with respect to the global economy of what it was in 1960, one-fifth. But the challenges are even bigger. So the system has to be recapitalized, and we need to improve the business model of the development banks, of the whole network, and we need flexibility to adapt to the realities of these countries. So, as the title of the report says, we do not have a crisis-resilient development finance system in place. Why? Well, first of all, we have an issue of governance. LDCs are absent from decision-making processes on the amounts, rules, mechanisms, and institutions that determine international flows of development finance to LDCs, whether they are bilateral or multilateral, public or private, ODA, FDI, or bank lending. The 46 LDCs combined account for only 4% of the voting rights of the World Bank. Only 4% of the voting rights of the World Bank. And these 46 LDCs, you correct me, Junior, but it's 1 billion people we are talking about. Yes? So it's 1/8 of the total population of the world. Similarly, due to their small quotas of the International Monetary Fund, LDCs received less than 2.5% of the general allocation of SDRs. the ones that were allocated in 2021, yes? So from the 650 billion SDRs that were emitted, the LDCs received 2.5%. So moreover, the system we have is simply too small. That's the second reason. I set the number of the World Bank. The same happens with liquidity. You know, the IMF can provide in crisis liquidity in a year what rich countries' central banks can print in a day. The Bretton Woods quota system is outdated and too often blames the victim in a world of global systemic shocks. And we lack a multilateral mechanism to deal with that, even as we desperately need one. They have been attempts, and they are really very welcome. You know, there was the SSDI, there was agreed by the G20. We have the common framework, and now we have the round table in the IMF. These are good steps in the right direction, but they are certainly not enough. The second thing is on the debt issue, as I said before, that there is no sense of urgency. And the problem we have is that according to our data, and I hope you have seen the World of Debt publication that we did in the GCRG, but we give this number that we have kept repeating. 3.3 billion people in the world live in countries that are spending more in servicing the debt than either on health or education. So how are we going to meet the SDGs if the basic needs cannot be financed by these countries? And as I said before, in the report, we establish that the LDCs are spending twice as much in servicing the debt than on the health sector. All of these issues are connected. As foreign investment dries up, the multilateral development banks underinvest, and emergency liquidity is lacking, capital costs for these countries go up, and these countries are forced to get into more expensive debts. So as debts mount, they crowd out development spending and investment. And a vicious cycle of squeezed fiscal and policy space unfolds, growing worse year by year. So maybe there is this resistance to characterize what is happening as a debt crisis, but what we are saying is that what we have is a development crisis, because these countries face impossible choices. So this is the problem we face. Systemic problems require systemic solutions. Our report proposes many of them. I will highlight very quickly 5. First, official development assistance for the LDCs. We need to live up to the commitments that have been made internationally. Right now, if the commitments, the targets will be met, they will generate additional flows of 63 billion in 2021, 63 billion. But remember, what was the gap that we said we had for the LDCs? 100 billion. So if we will live up to the commitments of ODA, we already will have 60% of what we need. So, you know, it's true that this is very expensive for the LDCs, but it's not very expensive for the world. These are not huge amounts of money for the international community. They are very difficult to be financed by the LDCs because they don't have the resources to do it. But imagine, we could, if we live up to our commitments, then we will have more than half of the problem solved. Second, multilateral development banks. The MDBs must reform in line with the Secretary General's proposed SDG stimulus program, which calls for a 500 billion USD increase in annual disbursements, a figure that was supported by the year's G20 expert group on the MDB reform that was chaired by Larry Summers. To achieve this, MDB's boards must agree on balance sheet optimization plans, and most importantly, on a new general capital allocation. And obviously, we are also in favor of the recycling of the SDRs through the MDBs. Third, climate finance. Climate finance needs to become simpler and more transparent, reversing the current situation of complexity and high costs that LDCs are facing. A spaghetti ball of regulation only helps those who can afford the most expensive lawyers, something that the LDCs cannot. Money needs to flow southwards. We have a $6 trillion sustainable fund market at the global level, but much of that most of it goes to developed countries, and less than 1% of it goes to LDCs. Fourth, central banks. LDC central banks can play a role in ensuring that finance flows are consistent with climate-resilient development. But this can only be done if they work in tandem with the structural transformation of LDCs. So far, Bangladesh is the only LDC that has engaged in climate central banking. Our report provides a novel and unique framework for LDCs' government decision-making on climate central banking. Allow me to add here that advanced economies' central banks also have an important role to play. Rising interest rates are really hurting highly indebted developing countries. Every hike has massive collateral damage. A policy mix is key. And fifth and lastly, loss and damage. We will be discussing this in COP28. So the new loss and damage fund can play a pivotal role for LDCs if adequate additional funds are made available, primarily in the form of grants, with transaction costs and lead times kept at a minimum, and if disbursements start quickly. The loss and damage fund can become the missing puzzle piece in the whole international financial architecture. We are only 1 month away from COP28. In closing, let me be clear about something. Inaction is a choice. There is more than enough wealth in the world to meet the Sustainable Development Goals and to get the LDCs out of their fiscal hole. It is not about lacking resources, it's about priorities. The clock is ticking, and we cannot afford to hesitate. Thank you.
Thank you very much, SG. Juno Davis, you have the floor, and we'll take questions from the floor and online, of course. Over to you.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much, Secretary General, for that very comprehensive presentation of the report, the Least Developed Countries report entitled Crisis Resilient Development Finance. I think you covered the report extremely well, so I will just say 1 or 2 points just to complement what the Secretary General said. The report shows that there are severe interlocked challenges at both the domestic and international levels which constrict the fiscal space of LDCs, and that in a way creates blockages to pathways to a more sustainable growth and development pathway. In many ways, this report focuses largely on fiscal policy. We do that by looking, as the SG very well highlighted, the impact of the poly crisis particularly the impact of the recent conflict in Ukraine, the impact of COVID-19, the recurrent climate crisis. We've seen that has had a very deleterious impact on the GDP growth performance of LDC since 2019. And we've also seen that it has led, since 2020, to an increase in poverty, an extra 15 million people now, extreme poverty. We look at the issue of external aid primarily because LDCs are still very dependent, or very highly dependent on it, but because also the modalities of that have changed, and in ways which have increased the loan component of the ODA that is provided, rather than the grant component, which is diminishing over time. And in addition to which, of course, as the SG said, ODA commitments are not being met fully. And in the report, we show some of the economic implications of that in terms of the financial flows through ODA that LDCs have, in a sense, foregone in terms of opportunity cost. I think the same is true for climate finance in many ways. We've proposed in the report that, that there needs to be an LDC-specific climate goal, which is akin to the one that we see on ODA. There needs to be more access to grants, more funding for climate adaptation, and we want to see the implementation of a loss and damage fund, which we think could be pivotal for LDCs, that provides adequate additional funds that are made available primarily in the form of grants or concessional finance. The international community can help widen fiscal space, I think, in probably the fiscal space in LDCs in probably three key ways. Firstly, it can do so by financing needs to be, it can make this financing available at the required scale that LDCs need. It can deliver that finance through more appropriate low-cost instruments, and this needs to be underpinned by an international financial architecture that is adapted to the LDC-specific needs in line with the principles of aid effectiveness. I think when we began this report, we began with the idea in mind, given the range of discussions that are taking place currently about reform of the international financial architecture, the UN Secretary General's policy brief that was launched talking to these matters just 3-4 months ago. When we began this report, we were thinking, what could be done through the international financial architecture that could make LDCs seem more relevant to the system and better address their needs. And in some ways, that was the starting point from which we began to think about this issue, which led us to focusing, I guess, primarily on issues around fiscal space. I think in practical terms, I would just say two more things. In practical terms, I think this means that climate finance should be additional, and it needs to be an additional form of development finance, and it needs to be distinctly so. And we would argue very strongly that ODA goes back to perhaps this more traditional modality, which was in the form of providing grants and highly concessional loans, rather than the current practice. I don't think I have much more to add, because I think the SG's presentation was very comprehensive. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Junior. We are now going to take questions. I don't see any in the room, but we have a lot of people connected, a lot of journalists. I would like to Gabriel Tetro, Reuters. Can we unmute Gabriel? Over to you.
Yes. My question is for Secretary General Grynspan. You were in Moscow last month for some talks with Russian officials regarding unimpeded access to grain. I'm asking because it's related to, obviously, developing countries and least developed countries as well. Is there any progress on those talks and any more contacts planned regarding efforts to revive this deal? Thank you.
What the Secretary General has said and has been very firm on it is that we will continue to work to get Ukraine and Russian exports of food in the case of Ukraine, food and fertilizers in the case of Russia to global markets. And those consultations are in that, with that objective. We will continue to work to make it possible for the food and fertilizers from Russia and the food exports from Ukraine get into the global markets, because precisely as you said, this is extremely important for the food security of the world. And that's what we are continuing doing.
Thank you. I'm checking online. I don't see any hands up in the room. No. Yes, we have Ravi Kant. Can we unmute Ravi? Over to you, Ravi.
I just want to, I'm sorry I've come a bit late for this meeting. So I don't know what has been said before. But my general question is this, that the impact on the LDCs, given the interest rate increases in the US and their doubling of the debt payments and serious economic and fiscal crisis, what exactly is the kind of macroeconomic situation we have with the LDCs who are unable to pay their debt? Thank you. It's both to the Secretary General and to the UNCTAD LDC expert.
Thank you, Ravi. Yes, the situation is bad, as you can imagine. Well, the first thing is that according to the research and the modeling of the Federal Reserve of the US, every point of increase in interest rates from their part means a 0.8% decrease in growth perspectives for the developing countries in a period of 3 years. So if you think that the interest rates have more than quintuple, have been multiplied by around 5, if you do the math, you will get a staggering number in terms of the impact in the developing countries. This is not our research. This is, I am citing the research, quoting the research of the Federal Reserve. Now, right now what we see is not that necessarily that the interest rates will continue to rise, but that they will stay high for a long time. So the effects on the developing countries is, in a way, what we call the double burden. So it will affect their growth perspectives. It has meant for many of the developing countries a devaluation of the currency because of the strength of the dollar. And so domestic prices have gone up. And so you have, a phenomenon of imported inflation in these countries. And what is one of the commodities that has gone up more dramatically? Food. And so you have the most vulnerable being affected even further. Now, when you think, so where the sources of growth and the sources of finance will come from? And then you look at trade and you say, well, maybe trade. But the truth is that trade is slowing down. Trade is growing by half of the pace the global economy is growing. So you remember that at the beginning of this century, What we had is a very dynamic trade. Trade was growing much more than the economy, than GDP, and so trade was one of the engines of growth. But this is not happening this decade. So the dynamism for the economy is not coming from trade. Now, so we go and look at the investment. What is happened with foreign investment? And maybe investment is coming to these countries. And so that could be a source. But for LDCs, Junior, I hope you remember this number. I think that I'm right, but I will check it. LDCs receive from foreign direct investment 16% less in 2022 than in 2021. So foreign direct investment is going down, it's not going up. So where is the finance and sources of growth going to come from? We said in the report, in the Africa report, that maybe there is here an opportunity because many of the LDCs are commodity dependent and they are very rich in raw materials. And part of this wealth in raw materials are the raw materials needed for the energy transition. So maybe if we plan well, if we have the right policies inside the countries, and if we have as an objective not to sell just the raw materials, but to add value to the raw materials and to negotiate much better at the international level, there is an opportunity there that maybe we can tap on. That's one. But the other is that, you know, the resources for the investments that we need to do for the SDGs will have to come a lot from the international community. So countries have to do their work, yes? Nobody can do that for them. They have to have the right policy in place. They have to be stable. They have to be able to have a long-term vision, yes. But at the same time, we will need the financing to come from it. And that's why we look at the international financial architecture, we look at the multilateral development banks, and we look at the commitments on ODA and loss and damage that, you know, come from the wealthier countries in the world. The mix is the solution. Only one thing won't work. The mix is the solution. Because if the network of the multilateral development banks comes in, then they can have instruments to scale up private investment, to de-risk the perception of risks of the private sector. And it's the combination that will be the right way to go. In the World Investment Report that we launched some weeks ago, it's interesting, Ravi, please check this because it's an interesting thing. They demonstrated that in energy projects, if you have public government resources, multilateral development banks resources, and private sector resources, actually the cost of capital goes down 40%. And so you can make a lot of projects viable and profitable if you can lower capital cost in 40%. Yes? So this is what we are trying to do. We are trying to say, look, it's true that these countries can do better in terms of policy and stability, but at the same time, if they don't have the support of the international community, what we want to happen won't happen because they don't have the fiscal space and the macroeconomics at the global level, not because they did anything wrong, just because of cascading crises, just because of systemic shocks, don't allow them to get out of the debt trap and the fiscal trap.
Thank you very much. I have Nina Larsson from AFP online. Over to you, Nina.
Yes, thank you for my question. I had a question for the Secretary General. Also, on the Black Sea grain deal, I was wondering how you think that the collapse of that deal specifically has impacted the LDCs, if you have any sort of calculation on that. And also, you're saying, I mean, there's a lot of international support that is needed for the LDCs, but as you mentioned, the world is in crisis or tension.
Yes, the sound is very bad. Can you repeat?
The second part of, I understood the first part, but the second part of the question I couldn't hear.
Okay, can you hear me better now? Or is it, yes? Okay, the second part of my question was just about the need for international support at a time when the world is in crisis and attentions are diverted elsewhere, especially right now with the Gaza war. I'm just wondering how concerned you are, or how likely you think it is that the international community will be able to step up and actually focus on the LDCs in their time of need. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. Well, with respect to the Black Sea Grain Initiative and the effect of the withdrawal of Russia from the deal, what we have seen in the markets is more volatility. The prices did spike at the beginning, but they have become stable. They have shown a downward trend since then, with some hiccups, especially because of what is happening in the Middle East. But prices did not go up as they were at the beginning of the war in Ukraine. And this is because the aggregate volumes that are getting to the market are enough right now. The problem is the uncertainty, and that's why is the volatility. And the other problem is the transaction costs. What we have seen is that the transaction costs have gone up. You know, shipping, insurance, servicing, that has gone up. And the distribution has changed. And in this case, although at the aggregate level, the volumes are fine, and especially Russia is having one of the largest harvests in its history. And Ukraine has been able to continue exporting through the corridor that they have opened and also through the solidarity lanes. So volumes are not suffering so much, but transaction costs are suffering, uncertainty is there, and volatility is there. And the important thing here is that we need to get to an understanding of the importance of the Black Sea for the trading system with respect to food and with respect to food security, and that trading area has to be secured. With respect to if the world will look at the LDCs, given all the emergencies and crises that we are living through, you are absolutely right in asking that question. And I don't have the answer. What I definitely know is that we need to raise awareness of what is happening in these countries, because people are suffering, and they will suffer much more if they are not paid attention to. And every crisis that happens everywhere will hit them without them having anything to do with the crisis. It will hit them, because if the conditions at the international level will get worse, the first victims, economic victims, will be the LDCs and the vulnerable countries. So it's our duty in the UN, it's our duty in UNCTAD to raise awareness of the needs of these countries. And as I said before, it's not that we are talking about quantities that cannot be met by the international community. They could be met, and they will do or make all the difference for these 1 billion people that lives in the LDCs.
Thank you very much, SG. I think it's a good conclusion for this press conference, as I don't see any additional question. I will just remind you that we are under embargo until 4 p.m., 3 p.m. GMT, yes. So thank you very much. You can come back to us if you need any clarification. The team behind Juno Davis is available for clarification and more to say on this report if you need. And we see you soon. Thank you.
Thank you.